Hello Year 11, this is Lesson 9 in the booklet Unit 2.4 on Variation and Evolution. In this lesson we're going to continue talking about natural selection, but particularly talking about Charles Darwin and a little bit of the history and what was involved in his theory and the problems as well that he experienced. So the lesson objective today is learning to understand the significance of Darwin, and we mustn't forget as well the Welshman Alfred Russel Wallace, his theories with Darwin that they made together. So you need to turn to page 37 in your booklet, please. So on the top of page 37 we can see a photograph of Darwin here. He lived between the 12th of February 1809 to the 19th of April 1882, and he was 73 years old when he passed away, so it was quite a good age for somebody living in that era, in that time. This photograph or picture on the top left, okay, is very significant. This is HMS Beagle, and it is the boat that Darwin travelled on halfway across the world, okay, to the Galapagos Islands on the other side of the world. So you've got to bear in mind, when he did this journey, he'd got married to his wife, and he'd had, I think, 1 or 2 children at least, okay, and he decided he was going to make this quite treacherous journey on this ship to go and investigate his theory. And he first proposed his theory in 1859. He'd been involved then in not just one voyage but several voyages to the Galapagos Islands aboard HMS Beagle, and when he got there he noticed that the finches, a breed of bird that lived there, fed on different types of food. So the Galapagos is a series of islands, and what we call an archipelago, okay? And on each island, when he rode between them, he noticed that the birds had several differences. They were all finches, but they had differences, particularly in their beak shape, okay? And their beak shape seemed to be suited to help them eat a particular type of food that was found on that island, okay? So we can see the ones that ate leaves might have had a beak like this. Insects, slightly pointier, a little bit of a narrower beak, okay? If it was a tool-using finch, they learnt how to perhaps take the spine from a cactus, hold it in their beak and use it to actually get insects or grubs out of the bark on trees. Again, this one for grubs got quite a sharp, pointy beak, okay? The lower part is a little bit shorter. And for buds and fruits and things like nuts, you need a much stronger, more powerful beak, okay? So there's a question at the bottom of page 37, and it says, using the idea of natural selection, so remember our VMASBG, okay, describe how each beak on the finch above helps it to survive and how these birds may have evolved to have different beaks on the different islands. So I'm going to use some information from BBC Bitesize to help you with this. So first of all, new species can arise because of a result of either genetic variation, where there's been a mutation and an organism has changed slightly. So it'll have a wider range of alleles that control their characteristics. Natural selection that we've talked about when we were talking about the rabbits 2 lessons ago, where the alleles which help an organ to survive are selected for in each population, normally by predation or survival. And then also at the end of the rabbit discussion, we talked about speciation, where the populations, the 2 different groups of rabbits, became so different that they can't interbreed anymore. So new species can also arise because of this, because of isolation. And so we saw that in the rabbit example where the river separated the 2 different populations. So if the 2 populations become geographically separated because they are on different islands, and even though they could fly between them, if the islands start moving further and further apart, it's not realistic for the birds to be able to fly over the sea because they might run out of energy and have nowhere to land. So, for example, Charles Darwin described speciation of finches in this way. You've got to remember he was travelling at a time where we didn't have cameras. You couldn't record anything. The only way you could record it was by either drawing the finches. So he spent a lot of his day actually observing and drawing the shapes of the beaks and watching what they ate, okay? or actually bringing home specimens with him. And quite often these specimens were stuffed. So a lot of the specimens that are still in the Natural History Museum up in London today are ones that were brought back on HMS Beagle, okay, from Darwin's voyage. So these are just some of his illustrations, his drawings of the different beaks and head shapes of the different finches. And he studied the wildlife on these Galapagos Islands, okay, that are 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. And he noticed that the finches on different islands were similar to each other, but also had differences too, okay. So the finches showed this wide variation in their size and their beaks and their claws from island to island, okay? So this is the first bit of explaining natural selection amongst the finches. For example, their beaks may be different depending on the local food source, okay? And this variation, remember, would have been caused by a mutation. Now, Darwin knew nothing about genetics at this point, okay? But he realised that there was something being passed on. So variation due to the mutation, okay? Having these variations might have been an advantage, okay? So if it was an advantage to have a short, sharp, pointy beak, it meant that you could get the insects out from between the bark. If this was an advantage, it helped you to survive. If you were able to survive, you could breed, and as a result, you could pass those genes on to the next generation. So Darwin concluded that because the islands are so far from the mainland, that the finches that had arrived there had changed over the time that they'd been there. So each finch on each island had adapted, perhaps because of mutation was an advantage to them. That gave them a difference in what they looked like and how they behaved. It helped them to survive, breed, and pass their genes on. So, can you answer the question that's on the bottom of page 37, please? Pause the video at this point. So, after returning from one of these journeys, this set Darwin thinking. Perhaps the birds had somehow adapted to the climate and the food types on the different islands. He looked at fossils in the museums in Britain on his return, and he realised that species had changed since the huge dinosaurs roamed the earth. And then his upbringing kicked in. Most people in the 1800s were brought up in the Christian faith, and they would have gone to church on a regular basis, and perhaps a lot of people may have been illiterate, and so they would have relied on the church actually informing them of the stories from the Bible and the theories and the ideas of creationism. So his upbringing kicked in. Species are unchangeable, that's what people had been told, and God made them so, that God had created everything on this planet in 6 days, and on the 7th day he'd rested. So this was, you have to remember, the 1800s, when doctrine ruled the world and scientists were actually discouraged to disagree with religion. While it may seem strange to us, if any church proclaimed a scientist to be lying or going against the doctrine, the scientist would be forced to give up his research or be publicly embarrassed. He may even be imprisoned. And so this is what they did to Darwin. They did publicly embarrass him and humiliate him. So imagine how people would react to Darwin saying that God didn't make all the species in the world. With this in mind, Darwin spent a long time collecting his evidence to back up his theory, as he was so worried about how it would be met, particularly by the church. So he wrote his book. It was called The Origin of Species, and within this book he came up with his theories, that was that all species that exist today on planet Earth, and many more which we know are extinct now but have lived on planet Earth because we've seen the fossil records, have all evolved from simple life forms that first developed more than 3 billion years ago on our planet. So this was quite a striking, profound theory to have come up with at the time. So Alfred Russel Wallace is on the left-hand side, Darwin is on the right-hand side, okay? So what did they come up with together? So Darwin said, first of all, that species would gradually change over time to adapt to their environment. Then he got a bit stuck and he wrote to his good friend, the Welshman Alfred Russel Wallace. He suggested Darwin look at the reasons why a species may need to change. And between them, Darwin and Wallace came up with the idea that whatever the reasons for these changes, and whatever the changes were, the adaptations would have to be passed on to the offspring somehow. And that's the key bit, the difference between, Lamarck and Darwin's, that these adaptations would have to be inherited. They'd have to be in every single cell, or they would have to be in the sex cells to pass on. So there's 3 bullet points, and this should be familiar to you, by now, because we've been talking about VMA, SBG, for the last 2 lessons. That within an individual organism, within a species, there will be wide ranges of variation. So there's our first key word. That you will have predation, disease, and competition will cause some of these individuals to die. But it's the individuals with characteristics that are most suited to the environment that are more likely to breed and pass their genes on. So the only thing that's missing out of here that he didn't know at the time was that variation was caused by mutation. He could see changes, but he didn't know they were called mutations. And that if you had a mutation that made you different, that you had an adaptation, that this might be an advantage. So you survive as opposed to die. And that would mean that you would breed and pass your genes on. So this is known as natural selection or survival of the fittest, as we've already talked about. Turn over the page to page 39. So a little question for you to do. This is called a crossbill. Again, it's very similar to a finch, and it feeds by using its bill, its beak, to force apart the scales on conifer cones, so pine cones. It then uses its tongue to extract the seeds, and if the bill is clipped, it grows back again. So scientists were interested in the evolution of the bill of the crossbill, and in an investigation, seems quite cruel, they clipped the bills of several crossbills so that their bills no longer crossed. They observed that the crossbills with clipped bills took much longer to get seeds. Use this information from their investigation to suggest an explanation for the evolution of the bill in the crossbill. In your explanation, use the idea of selection, competition, and mutation. Pause the video and see if you can write down an answer that will give you 4 marks for this. So, what they're looking for, if the person has given an explanation with regard to Lamarck, they can only achieve a maximum of 2 marks, But what we're looking for is the full 4. So they've given us a selection of 5 here. First of all, you may have used this word, that there's a mutation that first of all produces a bird whose bill was crossed. Do not allow birds decide to mutate. They don't make the decision. It's completely random mutation. It's due to the genes mixing up or not copying exactly during mitosis and meiosis. Birds then, and this is the one that most people miss out, compete for food or seeds. If you're a mutant crossbill, so you've got this crossed bill, it makes it easier to obtain food faster or more successfully. So therefore, you've been selected for by nature, or you're more likely to survive, which is what we tend to see students, to be able to reproduce or mate or breed or produce offspring. So they haven't given a mark for the passing the genes on, So read through your answer, check what you've written, and add in anything that you've missed out. Turn to page 40 then. So we've already discussed a few of the problems with Darwin's theory. This image here was actually in the newspaper around about the time when Darwin lived, and they purposely drew him as an ape to try and publicly humiliate him, to embarrass him, because the church was so offended by his ideas and views and theories at that time. So after the initial scientific and public outrage and humiliation of Darwin, as seen in this cartoon drawn of him opposite, it took many years of gathering evidence before other scholars started to accept his theory based on solid facts. Unfortunately, because he was alienated because of his ideas, a lot of other scientists didn't want to be associated with him for fear that their own ideas may also be rejected by the church. So the evidence from the fossil record that he collected and the studies of the living species was scientific enough to change the scientific community's opinion of Darwin. And slowly people started to come round to his ideas and try and convince other people that it was a relevant theory at the time. However, not all people were convinced, and when he first published his book, Origin of Species, he pointed out that all apes and humans shared characteristics such as facial features, opposable thumbs, and certain types of behaviour. And so needless to say, the church was not happy with that, because they felt that humans were created in the image of God. Today, Darwin is seen as the founder of modern evolutionary studies. He even used to appear on the back of £10 notes. But one thing did evade him at the time. How was information passed from one generation to another? He didn't understand about the genetics. It was years after publishing his work and after years of ridicule and research, Darwin was still haunted by the fact that he couldn't work out how the information was passed from parent to offspring. 50 years after Darwin's book was published, another biologist, an Austrian monk called Gregor Mendel, who we came across in the last booklet, published his theories on the genetics of inheritance. If Darwin had been able to read this book, it would have explained the mechanism of inheritance and variation to him. Unfortunately, he never got to read it. So, a couple of questions at the bottom of this page. Pause the video to see if you can answer these, and then we will go over them. So, why do you think Darwin was so ridiculed when his book was first published, Origin of Species? It's because the majority of the population believed in creationism, and they felt that his book and some of his ideas and theories were what we would call blasphemy, going against the church and going against the word of God. Why did people not just brush him off as another loony? Well, he had collected enough evidence. So the evidence came from the fossil record, and this backed up his ideas. And other scientists could actually see what he was talking about made sense. Some schools, particularly in what we would call the Bible Belt area of America, refused to teach Darwinism. So give your opinion on whether you think it is right or wrong to refuse to teach his theory, okay? So this is an opinion question. There is no right or wrong answer to it. It is based on what your views are. But going back a few years, we used to, when we did the AQA exam paper, we used to have to be careful to look out for questions where there were questions on evolution, where the schools had, prior to the children getting the papers, had actually either ripped out the question or put a cross through it and refused to allow the children to answer the question, thereby meaning that they were unable to access those questions and score points on them because they didn't believe in the theory of evolution. Question 4, if Darwin had read Mendel's work on genetics, how do you think that would have changed his theory? He would have been able to explain the mechanism of inheritance of these mutated genes and how the genes that were an advantage enabled that organism to survive and be passed on to the next generation. Why do you think Darwin's theory was only gradually accepted by the majority of the scientific community? People were worried that their research was going to be impacted on by showing any kind of association with Darwin at the time, because he had so offended and upset the church and the ideas that were currently around evolution, that it was the theory of creationism instead. So that is the end of this lesson on a little bit of the history of Darwin. Next lesson will be a much shorter one. It will be on extinction, and then we have one more lesson to cover to complete this unit. And I'm hoping that the next booklet will be coming out to you then soon. Okay, thank you, Year 11.